collapse of Building 7. What they faced was no easy task. Contrary to the Twin Towers, Building 7 had not been hit by an airplane. It was only partially damaged by the collapse of the North Tower, and it suffered fires that were anything but devastating. Nothing could have suggested it was going to collapse. On the other hand, it looked like the perfect controlled demolition. It featured the sudden onset of the collapse, the rapid acceleration towards the ground, the symmetrical descent of the structure, and it even appeared to have started the collapse from the bottom, as most controlled demolitions do. Professionals in the field of controlled demolitions, such as Dutchman Danny Juwenko, seem to have no doubt on what had happened.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts. We weten heel goed wat ze doen, die jongens. Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Similar comments were made by TV anchors watching the replay of the collapse.
It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
In spite of what seemed obvious to everyone, NIST came up with an absolute historical first.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse.
According to NIST, the collapse was triggered by the failure of one specific column, number 79, located in the northeastern section of the building.
So you look at the floors failing here, and eventually this column 79 is going to buckle, it fails, and then the entire vertical progression takes place.
NIST blamed thermal expansion as the phenomenon that caused the collapse, which was also an absolute first in history.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Coming from such a reputable organization, these kinds of statements should have sent shockwaves through the architectural world.
What they're telling us is that our existing building codes, to which thousands of skyscrapers are currently designed, there's a serious problem.
If NIST's findings were true, hundreds of skyscrapers from all over the world would suddenly be in danger of a collapse due to fire. This should have called for the immediate suspension of all high-rise constructions, widespread verifications in all existing skyscrapers, and a serious revision of fire codes and safety regulations for the new ones to be built. None of that has happened. Steel skyscrapers have continued to be built just as usual. The ones that caught fire, even when fully engulfed in flames, have continued to remain standing. And not one of the basic tenets of fire protection has been modified when it comes to designing high-rise steel buildings. At the same time, it should be noted that NIST's report on Building 7 was never published by a peer-reviewed publication. This means their analysis of the collapse cannot be validated from a scientific point of view. Even though this was an unprecedented event in history, we are being asked by NIST to take their word for the soundness of their conclusions.
It's based on sound science, and it is consistent with all the observations we have.
But it has never happened before, right?
But the physics is consistent, it's sound, it's been analyzed, and we have the results. And we are very comfortable with our findings.
They might have been comfortable, but the scientific community of architects and engineers was not.
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
Architects and Engineers has asked NIST to at least verify the computer model on which they've based their theory of the collapse. But also in this case, NIST has refused to make their data public.
Structural engineers rail against NIST because they refuse to show the visualization. It's a black box. You cannot download any of this data.
This means that also for the accuracy of their computer model, we have to take NIST's word for it.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
This is the video of the event. On the right is one of the two animations released by NIST on the collapse of Building 7.
When you observe the footage of how the building failed, and when you look at the animation of the failure, and compare that to what you actually observe in reality. I think they disproved their own theories. It is impossible for it to fail the way they said.
The second animation released by NIST is even more inconsistent with the real event. While the animation shows a pronounced inward bending of the top of the structure, the video footage shows the entire top section of the building maintaining its shape all the way through the visible part of the collapse. This can be verified by different angles. If this is what NIST calls matching quite well, one can imagine what the reliability of their entire report can be. A similar problem is presented by the computer model NIST has used to simulate the progression of the fires in the building. This computer model was developed by NIST, and no one has been allowed to verify it. Again, we are being asked by NIST to trust them on its validity.
We used a well-validated computer program developed at NIST for studying the growth and spread of fires to calculate temperatures throughout the building. On the right in this slide, for example, you see a detailed fire simulation showing the temperature of fires as they grew and spread on floor 12.
The graphic shows the temperatures in floor 12 rising after 1 p.m. and peaking around 4 p.m. on the northeastern side of the building. But the same picture NIST has published in their report, which was taken between 3:49 and 3:54 p.m., shows that the fires have already died off across the entire eastern section of the 12th floor. A similar picture, taken between 3:53 and 4:02 p.m., confirms that the fires on the eastern side of the 12th floor had already died off. NIST itself has stated in the same page that there is no indication of fires burning on the east side of the 12th floor at this time. In other words, the accuracy of NIST's computer model doesn't even need to be verified, as it's disproven by the very pictures and statements NIST has published in their own report. In order to justify the first and only collapse in the history of a steel skyscraper due to fire, the debunkers have maintained that Building 7 was weaker than the average steel structure because it had been built over an existing electrical substation.
Alors, une des particularités de cette tour 7, c'est qu'elle a été bâtie sur un bâtiment existant qui est une sous-station électrique qui avait été construite dans les années 60, alors que la tour 7 a été bâtie dans les années 80. On verra que ça a été une des raisons de la ruine de ce bâtiment.
The building was extremely unconventional. It had this giant Con Ed substation with enormous trusses carrying extraordinarily high loads, very vulnerable to fire and other kinds of damage.
But NIST itself has refuted this possibility. From the final report we read, the transfer elements such as trusses, girders, and cantilever overhangs that were used to support the office building over the Con Edison substation did not play a significant role in the collapse of World Trade Center 7. In fact, it was the opposite. After it was completed, Larry Silverstein had the building reinforced beyond its requirements in order to accommodate the needs of its main tenant, Salomon Brothers. From this 1989 New York Times article we read, Salomon Brothers intends to spend nearly 2 years and more than $200 million cutting out floors, adding elevators, reinforcing steel girders, upgrading power supplies, and making other improvements in its million square feet of space. We built in enough redundancy to allow entire portions of floors to be removed without affecting the building's structural integrity, said Larry Silverstein, president of the company. More than 375 tons of steel, requiring 12 miles of welding, will be installed to reinforce floors for Salomon's extra equipment. If there was one skyscraper in the world that should have never collapsed due to fire, it was Building 7. While NIST has been unable to come up with a valid explanation for a collapse due to fire, there are at least 3 good reasons why such a collapse could not have happened in any case. One is the widespread pre-knowledge of the event. As we have said before, the collapse of a steel structure due to fire is considered an absolute impossibility in the architectural world.
Steel structural frame buildings, high-rise buildings, simply do not collapse due to fire.
We've never had a steel-framed skyscraper collapse in the United States or internationally.
No high-rise steel structure has ever been destroyed by a fire in the history of construction.
Consequently, if Building 7 was truly brought down by fire, it would have been a totally unexpected event, which would have taken everyone by surprise. It turns out instead that dozens of policemen, firemen, and first responders had been warned that the building was going to come down as early as 5 hours before it happened.
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
Firemen also had been warned of the impending collapse. Fireman Hollowak, we were just hanging out until Tower 7 came down. Fireman Sweeney, we stood and waited for World Trade Center 7 to come down. By 4 p.m., CNN had already picked up the rumor and was spreading it around the world.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
At 5 o'clock, the BBC announced that the building had already collapsed, even though it was still standing in the background.
Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
As you can see behind me...
At 5 o'clock, Building 7 can clearly be seen on the right of the picture. But the BBC correspondent, who was obviously unfamiliar with the landscape, didn't recognize it. This has fueled ludicrous conspiracy theories, which accuse the mainstream media of having been informed in advance of what was going to happen on September 11. In truth, this incident only confirms that the information on the impending collapse had been circulating long enough in downtown Manhattan to have already reached the BBC even before it happened. At about the same time, when CNN recorded the explosions near Building 7, they also captured the police clearing the area and announcing the collapse.
Keep your eye on that building, it'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back here. All right, guys? Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up.
This is the account by a paramedic who witnessed the collapse.
You know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and, you know, it was horrifying. And then, you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
There's even someone who heard a countdown moments before the building collapsed. First responder Kevin McPadden was stationed near Building 7, awaiting for orders from a Red Cross representative.
You know, he kept asking the Red Cross rep, what's going on, what's going on? And all the time he had his hand over the radio while he was getting a countdown. And then he's just like, at the last 3 seconds, he takes his hand off and you hear 3, 2, 1, and he had this like heartbroken face. He's just like, just run for your life. It was about a second or two after the countdown ended that you started hearing the explosions. Now, we're talking about bombs. Because, you know, you get that like, bam! You know, there's like a little explosion and then the force. And then boom, 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 boom. That was the building coming down.
Question. Given that the collapse of a steel skyscraper due to fire would have been an unprecedented event, how could so many people have known about it so many hours in advance? If the police clearing the area expected a structural failure due to fire, why would they use such an expression as, the building is about to blow up? Can you explain how an unprecedented, totally unexpected collapse due to fire could be predicted with absolute precision by an actual countdown? The second reason that makes the official explanation by NIST untenable is the symmetry of the collapse. As we have seen before, the entire top section of the building falls as a single piece, maintaining an almost perfect symmetry as it descends towards the ground.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse. And all you need to do is look at the videos and see that.
The exterior columns on the outside, as well as on the inside, at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
In order for the perimeter to fall perfectly and symmetrically, which it pretty much does at Building 7, all of those columns have to be removed within a tenth of a second of each other.
Question. Can you explain how the almost simultaneous removal of all the columns, which was necessary for Building 7 to collapse in the way it did, can be caused by fire alone? The last and possibly most conclusive piece of evidence against the official explanation is freefall. After the initial failure of the penthouse on the eastern side of the building, the entire structure came crashing down to the ground in a little more than 6 seconds. David Chandler of Architects and Engineers has measured the downwards acceleration of the building from the start of the global collapse.
You can measure the acceleration of Building 7 by video analysis. The slope of the velocity graph gives the acceleration. Note that global collapse starts suddenly, and for the next 2.5 seconds the building accelerates at the rate of 9.88 meters per second squared. In other words, the rate of collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 over the first 2.5 seconds is literally indistinguishable from free fall in a vacuum.
When Architects and Engineers presented NIST with these calculations, they forced them to correct their preliminary report and acknowledge the free fall of the building for the first 8 stories of the collapse. From NIST's final report we read, a more detailed analysis of the descent of the north face found 3 stages. The first was a slow descent with acceleration less than that of gravity that corresponded to the buckling of the exterior columns at the lower floors. The second stage was a free fall descent over approximately 8 stories at gravitational acceleration for approximately 2.25 seconds. 2.25 seconds is more than 1/3 of the global collapse. Once NIST had admitted the free fall for 1/3 of the collapse, the outcome of the debate was sealed.
Building 7, NIST reports admits fell at the rate of gravity for the first 100 feet. Well, that's impossible unless there's nothing resisting it.
NIST has always acknowledged this.
Free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it.
And, as we have seen before, the almost simultaneous removal of the supporting structure can only be obtained with a controlled demolition.
The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That evidence alone would indicate that the official story doesn't hold water.
Question: can you explain how free fall, which requires the almost simultaneous removal of the supporting structure, can be achieved without a controlled demolition? This very question was posed to